Okay, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be covering part of Unit 1 for Lesson 3.2 or Japan. Now, originally, this would have been something that we would have followed up right after China, but with everything that's been going on and then with Sharp Top, we just didn't have time to squeeze it in. So this gives us a chance to make sure that we watch the video, learn what we need to learn, while at the same time perhaps offering us or presenting us with opportunities to do some more things in class and, instead of just taking notes. So let's get started. Here we go. So when we're talking about Japan, similar to when we were talking about China, it's important for us to remember the context of the time period in which we're talking about. So this was not what we expect today when a king dies and a new prince comes to power, and there's this relatively smooth transition of power. In Japan, similar to China, similar to what we covered in the Mughal Empire, you have this challenging set of circumstances that is hard enough to see a peaceful transition from one ruler to the next at the time of the ruler's death, made even more so by the political and social structure of Japan at the time in which we're covering. So starting out, it's important to know, or it's important to recognize, chaos is vulnerable. It is an inherently destabilizing, inherently challenging situation to govern within, and then to govern during a period of transition. So when we're talking about Japan at this time, the shogun, or the military leader who is appointed by the emperor, and there's a picture of a shogun, that's from the Netflix, or excuse me, I think it's FX TV show. I've heard very good things about it. Feel free to check it out if you're interested. Uh, Basically, the shogun, or the military ruler appointed by the emperor, ruled in the absence of this robust and effective imperial government. So we didn't really have a strong central government to kind of oversee and manage the affairs of the country. So even though he was appointed by the emperor was largely considered to be a ceremonial position. He was in charge, quote unquote, but he didn't have a lot of direct authority. It was generally expected that if the emperor needed something to be really decided, or something that was truly important, that he would defer to the shogun, and then the shogun would kind of play along and say, okay, you're asking me my advice, here's what we should do. But it was really, and then the emperor would go along and say, okay, I'm going to make the call, but technically it was the shogun making the power. And what we have here is this Emperor Goto Jimikado. Don't worry about remembering. There's going to be a lot of names in this unit, guys. Don't worry about remembering all of the names. I'll call out when we need to make sure we pay attention to that, or when we see a name that we really need to remember. But you don't need to remember that emperor's name. He just happened to be the emperor at the time which we're talking about. So real power was really vested in the shogun. Essentially, he was basically, think of him as a military dictator. So Emperor Go Tsuchimikado dies, and you have what is called a succession crisis. We don't have a person to take over relatively smoothly, and the inability of the shogun to address citizen complaints and mollify dissent, or excuse me, his inability. No, there we go. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. A succession crisis and the inability of the appointed shogun, the shogun who happened to be there at the time, to address citizen complaints and mollify dissent, meant that by 1467, the country was in chaos. So this is known as the Sengoku Jidai, and we want to make sure we are familiar with that term, Sengoku Jidai, or the age of the warring states. And what we're really talking about, you can see on the map all of the differing warring period, all of the different clans, and these clans were essentially going back and forth in power contests, and fighting over who was going to attain supremacy of the island. Now, eventually, the daimyo emerge, and they're kind of, think of them as Japan's version of the knights that you're kind of familiar of thinking about when you think of the Middle Ages in Europe. Think of them as the feudal lords, semi-independent, but the more powerful they become, because we don't have a strong central government, the less power the shogun has, and even less power the emperor retains. He's still around. He's still kind of ostensibly, kind of, sort of calling some of the shots, but he becomes even more of a figurehead. And the daimyo are just making alliances left and right. They're, I'm going to team up with you if you'll help me beat this guy. So maybe the Mogami clan would team up with the Tokugawa clan. and then they would fight with the Shimatsu clan, who was teamed up with the Date clan. You have a lot of shifting alliances, and really the objective from all of these clans' perspectives is supremacy on the island. So what we see is unity through consolidation of power. So there are three men that are considered the most responsible for uniting Japan. The first one that we want to make sure that we've got in our memory banks is Oda Nobunaga, obviously from the Oda clan, if we remember the map from the previous slide. There's a contemporary painting of Oda Nobunaga. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. There's a contemporary of Toyotomi. And Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, hopefully at this point you recognize Mr. Stuckey's not going to ask you what was the difference between Oda Nobunaga and what was the difference between Toyotomi Hideyoshi. My questions are going to be specific for each individual, so it's important that we remember them. It's important to remember those characteristics, but think of them as characters in our story, and it might be a little bit easier to keep them distinct as far as what made them special, what made them important, and why it is important for us to remember them. So typical for the period, all three had, and there's Tokugawa Ieyasu. All three of them had difficult early lives. Now Nobunaga was called a clown and mistrusted by many. And so I did a fair bit of reading on this, and it's really kind of interesting. He wasn't a clown in the sense that he would do face paint and do face paint and go around in a circus. But he kind of grew up in a court that, kind of looked at him as sort of the younger sibling of the bigger kids, and he had a lot of fun. And so he would play jokes, and he would do handstands, and he would do magic tricks, and his tendency to be a little bit more playful and a little bit more make jokes and have a little bit more fun meant that a lot of people just didn't respect him. They thought he was kind of a clown, or the picture that I've got on here is kind of a jester. Kind of a court jester. He was the one that you didn't really pay much attention to. He's off on the side, and he made everybody laugh, but he didn't really bring anything to the table from a serious political or power standpoint. Now, Hideyoshi was a commoner, though a capable soldier. Now, what does that mean? Well, he was a commoner in the sense that he didn't come from a family of nobility, but similar to what we talked about with Babur, who, and one difference would be Babur did come from nobility, he was a capable soldier. And so Hideyoshi is this individual who starts to rack up military successes and become more and more successful. And so he is granted more and more power and more influence, even though he didn't come from a noble birth. Now, Ieyasu, interestingly enough, there's a modern picture of Ieyasu, so that's not contemporary. Ieyasu was actually hostage to a rival clan. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is if you had a clan that went to war with another clan, and the clan that went to war lost, well, instead of wiping out the entire clan because maybe as a leader of the leader of the clan that won the war, won the battle, you don't want to just wipe out your neighbor. You want to leave him in a position where at least you know he's there, at least you know he is reliably disloyal, kind of think of it that way. So instead of wiping him out, instead of just killing everybody, because you still have to have neighbors, you still have to have people who will trade with you, you still have to have people who potentially in a generation could end up being an ally of your country. And so Ieyasu was sort of given over to a rival clan as a hostage, and what that guaranteed was that Ieyasu's clan would not fight against the rival clan, because if they went to war against them, well, what's going to happen to Ieyasu? Well, they would kill him. So it's kind of a way to keep peace amongst you and a neighboring clan. You would basically trade hostages, and it was typically somebody who was somebody important to each individual clan, and that kind of in kind of a weird way, it meant that you could trust that the other guy wasn't going to attack you, because if he attacked you, you would just kill your hostage, and vice versa. So that was his upbringing, and that meant that he had the opportunity to learn at the court of the Lord, where he was a hostage. It meant that he was treated not as an equal, but at least not poorly. But it's still kind of a challenging way to grow up if you think about it, knowing that at any point something could happen, and there's the potential that that your life could end as a consequence of a political situation that's completely outside of your control. So Nobunaga and his son After many, many years of fighting, remember we're still going through this horrible period of warring states. Nobunaga and his son die by seppuku. So if you look at the picture here on the slide, you can see this would be an early print or an early depiction of Nobunaga leaping from this balcony. And essentially, it was during a tea ceremony, and he happened to be enjoying tea with his son, and he was betrayed by one of the lords in his council, in his circle. And leaping to safety, he still realizes that the compound where he was staying, being surrounded, that he doesn't have any opportunity for escape. And so he would what was typical, this carries over all the way through into World War II in some culture, or in some ways in the Japanese culture. Seppuku was ritual suicide. And it was a very graphic, very unpleasant way to die. But the idea was, well, if I'm caught, then I'm going to show how honorable and how noble I am by committing suicide through this very grotesque, very harsh way of killing myself. And it essentially, I'm not going to show a picture of it, but it essentially involved taking the knife, if you look on the picture there, taking a knife and using that to kill yourself by slicing across your abdomen, your stomach. Now, Hideyoshi was a loyal follower of Nobunaga, and upon hearing that Nobunaga and his son have been basically assassinated, though they did die by seppuku, they didn't have a choice because they were betrayed and cornered. Hideyoshi basically just goes on this rampage and avenges or takes revenge for the death of his lord, and he's actually very successful in uniting a lot more of Japan than anybody had been prior to Hideyoshi. And once he's got most of Japan pacified, he decides, well, why don't we go across the water and invade Korea? So if you look on the map, you can see the dates, 1597, 1592, and so on. It's kind of difficult to because all of the names are in Korean and some of the numbers are in Korean, it's kind of hard to tell. But you can kind of see, I mean, Hideyoshi is largely successful. He makes a pretty good trip up into northern Korea on that northern peninsula, and then he decides, well, why stop here? We're doing pretty well. Let's go ahead and swing westward and move into Ming China. Now he's in the midst of this when some civil unrest in China calls him back home, and he becomes ill during that journey. And realizing that his illness is unlikely to abate, realizing that he's probably not going to get better, he tries to do the best thing he can think of to do, which is guarantee the safety and protection of his son, with the expectation that his son will rule after he dies. So Hideyoshi appoints a council to rule on behalf of his son, and he picks 5 daimyo who he thinks are going to be loyal, and then he picks 5 civilian administrators. So why do we care? Well, it's an interesting attempt to break this habit in Japan of only ruling through military means. So you have the daimyo, you have these warlords who are going to be in charge, but there's an attempt to balance that council with 5 civilian administrators in hopes that, okay, maybe the 5 will outvote 5 of the others, or if there's an alliance between, say, 2 daimyo and 3 administrators, then his objective here is really to present a situation that would hopefully prevent any risk to his son and any danger to Japan falling apart again. Sadly for poor Hideyoshi, it doesn't work out that way. Almost immediately after Toyotomi dies, the council falls to infighting. You immediately start seeing squabbles. You start seeing schemes being hatched. And the objective here is, okay, the child of Hideyoshi he's not strong enough. There's no reason to keep this royal family around. Let's just go ahead and take over. But the council members couldn't agree on who was going to take over. And throughout all of this, you have Toyotomi Ieyasu, who is trying to maintain loyalty to his former ruler's child. He's trying to hold the council together. He's trying to argue, listen, let's stay with the young emperor until when he becomes old enough. to become shogun. Excuse me, I said emperor, but he's the shogun. When he's old enough to really become shogun, then we can follow him and we'll have peace and stability. But it's not working out that way. So Ieyasu says, okay, fine, then we're going to war. And Ieyasu is successful where others had fallen short in trying to establish supremacy, and is able to create the Tokugawa Shogunate. Again, his name Tokugawa Ieyasu makes sense that it would be known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. So he defeats all rivals. I had a video of the Battle of Sekigahara, and we may still watch it in class, but it's a very interesting sequence of events that essentially ends any threat of the Toyotomi clan. Now, one of the first things that Ieyasu does is relocate the capital to Edo, or otherwise today known as Tokyo. All right, moving on. Some pictures of Tokyo at the time. So, what was life like under the Tokugawa Shogunate? So, what you see for the next 200 years is this relative flourishing of the society, and a sense of stability and a condition of stability that had really been absent during the period of warring states. So, yes, things are definitely better. That being said, despite centuries of stability and the general improvement in the quality of life for the majority of Japanese, it's still a very hard existence. It's still a very hard time to be alive. A lot of the technological advances that are taking place in Europe with farming equipment in the 1600s and 1700s, they're not coming over to Japan. So it's still a very challenging time for the vast majority of people. And additionally, the hierarchy of the society was still very structured, very stratified. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you think about it in comparison to our context in the United States, one of the things that people like to think about in the United States, and I think this is still mostly true, and I think it's certainly mostly true in comparison to most of the other countries in the world, in the United States, there is still the opportunity for upward mobility, and that's an important phrase, upward mobility. The idea that it doesn't really matter where you start from, you have opportunities to better oneself, better your family station, better through education, through hard work, through developing relationships that are mutually beneficial. You still have this opportunity to rise in the social hierarchy. In Japan, that was still very hard to do. That's why it's heavily structured and very stratified. So if we take a look at this picture, it kind of gives us a picture of what Japanese feudalism looked like. And it's kind of interesting to look at. There's a lot of similarities and a lot of commonalities in what we would typically think of European feudalism, where if you were a salesperson, if you were a merchant, you're at the bottom rung. And if you're an artisan, well, you're a little bit better. You're artistic. You're bringing some things of beauty into the world. And then peasants were kind of sandwiched in between the artisans and the samurai. And once you get into the samurai, which think of them as soldiers of fortune who would go out and either working for a lord that they were committed to, a daimyo, a samurai could go and seek employment with other daimyo and make a name for himself. Think of them as a knight. That a knight in shining armor, like what you think about when you think of European medievalism. And then the daimyo, which were the semi-independent lords, and then the shogun, and then at the top is the emperor. But it's important to remember that the emperor, again, really didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of control over the country, didn't have a lot of responsibility. His primary job at this time is really just to kind of manage the perception of stability. If the emperor is consistently present, well, then we know that there's going to be, there's some idea, there's some perception that the society is still running in a stable manner. Now, for women, yes, women could get more positions of employment. They could go out and get jobs in a larger degree and with a little bit more freedom than they had been able to previously during the Tokugawa Shogunate this 200 years. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of women joining the workforce. It's still pretty much a patriarchal society where most of the time, and again, this is stereotype, this is not 100%, this is not And it's also not to say that this is how it should have been. This is just a description of how it was, as near as best as we can tell, as best as what the history tells us. They, for the most part, stayed home. So their primary responsibility was doing the chores around the house, managing the household, raising children, educating the children, and obeying the husband, of course. Again, patriarchal, meaning the man of the house being the head of the family. Now, during Sengoku Jidai, Christianity had been tolerated. Ieyasu, when he begins to really push for supremacy, one of the things that he recognizes very early on is that if he has a chance to win, he's going to need firearms, and that means he needs trade with European powers, which means I'm going to be nice to the Portuguese. So if we remember from our prior unit, we talked about the Portuguese. What were the two things the Portuguese were predominantly interested in their expansion into the Far East? Well, they wanted to spread the good word. There was an evangelical aspect to their exploration and to their desire for exploration and for expansion, and they wanted money. So this presented an opportunity for both. The Portuguese could practice Christianity under with Ieyasu's permission, and they could also sell him firearms, which meant they could make money. And during this time, they used trade to basically spread Christianity. And again, initially this is kind of tolerated. Ieyasu's like, well, I need the firearms, so I'm going to let this go along. But Christianity was very different than the religions that Ieyasu was familiar with, and it seemed novel, new, and understandably, it's something he's not that familiar with. He kind of thought of it as being a little scary. If you research some of the history of the Sengoku Jidai, it's a very interesting situation with Christianity and how it was looked upon by some of the other clans. You had some clans that were fully invested and absolutely supportive of Christianity, and some of them even converted and became Christian and became Christian clans. And it was kind of seen as the new kid on the block, the kind of the scary new religion that we're not quite sure about. And so once Ieyasu takes over, once he has the title of shogun and he has control of the country, he starts to get concerned about, there's a picture of some Jesuit priests that are preaching in Japan, but once Ieyasu has control, he starts to get a little uneasy. And this growing Christian influence leads him and others into more and more persecution of Christians, and you start to see more and more deaths, and you start to see more and more laws starting to get passed to kind of limit Christian religion and influence in Japan. This is a picture of some Christians that have been rounded up, and they're about to have a very bad end. Again, this fear was starting to permeate more and more society, and Ieyasu was not immune to it. He started to have distrust also. So quick break to talk about the art during the Tokugawa Shogunate. So here's the Edo period painting. I believe the name is the Great Wave. You've undoubtedly seen this. If you take Latin with Mr. Kelch, you've seen this painting on his wall, as a matter of fact. Very famous painting, came from this time period. We also have haiku. So it's important for us to know what a haiku is. It's a very specific rhyming scheme, 7, 5, 6 syllables, 7, 5, 6 syllables, each per line, and you have to try and convey whatever artistic sentiment you possess in that limited amount of syllable, in those limited syllables and in that limited space. So in this case, on a journey, ailing, my dreams roam about over a withered moor by Basho. So, it's interesting. Haiku is a very challenging form of poetry. If you like poetry and you like writing poetry, I recommend it because, again, it does encourage a lot of discipline. It does require a lot of discipline. And then kabuki theater was another example of artistic forms during this time period. So bringing us back, that's kind of give us arts, the concept of arts in the Tokugawa Shogunate. So Japan closes up. What does that mean? Well, continued contact with the Portuguese and with Christianity eventually leads Ieyasu to become increasingly wary, and so he essentially says, okay, no more. going forward, we're going to allow trade in Nagasaki, and that's it, one town. That will be the only port in which we will interact with foreigners, and the only two countries that we're going to allow to do business with us, this is an old woodcut of the port, will be the Dutch and the Chinese. Now, pause here for a moment and think about, why would it be the Dutch and the Chinese? So why the Dutch? What made the Dutch special? Well, if we remember again, the Portuguese and the Spanish are exploring the world for two reasons: God and money. And one of the things that made the Dutch different, they had already fought a war of independence because they wanted the opportunity to worship Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism. They were Protestant. And so their perspective was different than the Spanish and the Portuguese. They were much more liberal in their appreciation of the right to worship. And so when the Dutch were establishing trading outposts, what did they not do? They didn't try to convert anybody. Their primary objective was trade and generating income, making money. So it kind of explains why the Dutch would have been one of the only European power that would be allowed to trade with the Japanese, because the Dutch didn't walk into Nagasaki and start trying to convert everybody, as opposed to the Portuguese and the Jesuit priests, who almost immediately tried to convert everybody. So once this happens, once this trade, the limitations for trade are put into place, and now that you have Europeans forbidden to enter and Japanese are forbidden to leave, you've essentially turned Japan into a closed society for 200 years. And it's a very interesting set of circumstances as a consequence of this. When we start talking about Japan getting close to the 20th century, the late 19th century, it becomes clear just how significant and how substantial the implications of this decision were. And it's important to remember what happens to a society when instead of adapting to the changing times, instead of incorporating new ideas, new beliefs, new systems of monetary exchange, instead of incorporating those and synthesizing meaning, instead of combining what works in your society with what you observe working in another society, so that you as a society become even better going forward, because they're a closed society, they miss out on so many advances, both technological and social, and it has drastic consequences when we catch up with Japan in the latter half of the 19th century. Predominant religions at this time are Confucianism and Zen Buddhism, with the latter meaning Zen Buddhism focusing on contemplation and meditation. So be thinking about what those long-term consequences in Japanese society, what that's going to look like. It's important to think about that. So this will be contextual. This is not something we're going to quiz or test on. Zen Buddhism beliefs. Those are some of the 10 rules of Zen. And it's kind of shorthand. It's not really letting go of comparing. That's not how they put it, but it kind of is the way to kind of reduce it to the sentiment of the message. And then if you get all the way to number 10, you say, well, have a proper laugh once a day, because you're probably going to have a very challenging time not feeling guilty about something you did wrong and you shouldn't have done it. Letting go. Now you're not worrying about things, not regretting, oh man, I really shouldn't have done that. That's a hard thing to do, but the idea was we're going to meditate and we're going to contemplate our choices so that we can become better versions of ourselves going forward. Here's a little bit more let's say a more official way of thinking about it, and these are just some ways of thinking about Zen principles and how organizing a society around these principles. We can kind of think, well, maybe these some of these principles are things that we could appreciate, or at least acknowledge a society using these principles would be successful. Painful things are going to happen. We need to be present. We need to be mindful. Meditation is important. So taking time to be quiet and at peace and contemplative about things that have happened and things that are coming up in our future. Minimizing our focus on just ourselves, thinking about how we incorporate into a society and how we can either help build up a society or how we can become part of a problem in a society. Trying to maintain simplicity somewhat so that we don't become overly complicated either in how we decorate our house or being obsessed with getting a lot of things. And then the importance of compassion and grace and not being judgmental. So thinking about these concepts, it's kind of understandable where this might be beneficial for our society. And that's it. That's going to be Japan. So again, you can return to this video as often as you like. You can review it. I highly suggest it. There will be material on this in this video that will be on our Unit 1 test and that will show up again on the final exam. Let me know if you have any questions. You know where I am, you know where my class is, and you know where I am for advisory, or excuse me, for tutorials. So anytime you need me, come see me and we'll talk things through. Until then, we will continue with our exploration into history next time we meet. Thanks very much for your attention.